I thought I was going crazy when I pulled into my cabin driveway and saw strangers walking around my property with measuring tapes. But when I spotted my two sisters handing out keys to my lakefront retreat while discussing profit margins, I realized something far worse was happening. Patricia and Sandra stood on my front porch, like they owned the place, collecting cash deposits from 3 different families who apparently believed they were renting my inherited cabin for their summer vacations. My jaw dropped as I watched a middle-aged woman with a clipboard walk through my bedroom window, taking photos, while my younger sister Sandra cheerfully explained the rental rates and availability calendar they had apparently created without ever asking my permission. I slammed my car door loud enough to make everyone turn around. The families scattered like startled deer suddenly sensing the tension crackling through the mountain air. Patricia, my 42-year-old sister, with her perfectly styled blonde hair and designer sunglasses, straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin in that familiar defiant pose I remembered from childhood arguments. "Howard, we need to talk," she announced, her voice carrying that authoritative tone she had perfected during her years as a real estate agent. Sandra, 3 years younger and usually more diplomatic, shifted nervously beside her, clutching a leather portfolio filled with what looked like rental agreements. "Talk about what exactly," I demanded, gesturing toward the confused families now gathering near their cars. "About why you're showing strangers through my private property. About why you're collecting money for something that doesn't belong to you." Patricia's expression hardened. "This cabin belongs to all of us, Howard. Just because Dad left it in your name doesn't mean you have the moral right to keep it locked up and empty while your sisters struggle financially." The word struggle hit me like a slap. I knew Patricia's husband Derek had been having problems, but I hadn't realized how serious things had gotten. Sandra stepped forward, her brown eyes filled with tears that seemed genuine enough. "Howard, I'm going to lose my house," she whispered. "Marcus lost his construction job 6 months ago, and we're 4 payments behind on our mortgage. The bank sent us a foreclosure notice last week." My anger softened slightly, but confusion replaced it. Why didn't you just ask me for help? Why go behind my back with this elaborate rental scheme? Patricia laughed bitterly. "Ask you for help? When was the last time you even called us? You disappear up here every weekend playing hermit in Dad's workshop while we deal with real-world problems." Sandra opened her portfolio and spread several documents across the porch railing. "We've done the research, Howard. This cabin could generate $15,000 per month during peak season. We found comparable properties on Airbnb that charge $300 per night. I studied the papers, recognizing the professional layouts and detailed financial projections. They had clearly invested significant time and effort into this plan." Patricia pointed to a highlighted section showing projected annual revenue. "Look at these numbers. We could split the profits 3 ways and everyone benefits. You keep ownership, we handle all the management and marketing, and we each make enough money to solve our problems." "But I don't want strangers tramping through Dad's cabin," I protested. "This place holds memories. His tools are still in the workshop exactly where he left them. His coffee cup is still on the kitchen counter." Sandra's voice turned sharp. "Memories don't pay mortgages, Howard. Sentiment doesn't put food on the table or keep families together." Patricia pulled out another document, this one bearing an official-looking letterhead. "We've already contacted Sunset Vacation Properties. They're one of the most reputable rental management companies in the state." My blood ran cold as I scanned the contract. "This has my signature on it." "We knew you'd be resistant to change," Patricia said calmly. "Sometimes family has to make difficult decisions for the greater good. You forged my signature." I grabbed the paper, studying the handwriting that definitely resembled mine but felt wrong somehow. "This is fraud, Patricia. This is actual criminal fraud." Sandra stepped between us. "It's not fraud when we're trying to save our families. When we're trying to honor Dad's memory by making this place productive, instead of letting it sit empty. I noticed movement in the cabin windows and realized the rental families hadn't completely left. One man was still inside, apparently taking measurements of the living room. My personal belongings, including Dad's reading glasses on the side table, were being casually moved around by strangers who believed they had legitimate rights to be there. "How long has this been going on?" I demanded. Patricia and Sandra exchanged a look that told me everything I needed to know before Patricia finally answered. "We started showing the property 3 weeks ago. The first rental is supposed to begin next Monday." The magnitude of their betrayal crashed over me like a cold wave from the lake. They hadn't just forged one document. They had built an entire business operation around my property without my knowledge or consent. I thought about all the weekends I had driven up here expecting solitude and restoration, never suspecting my sisters were treating my inheritance like their personal ATM machine. "Get everyone off my property right now," I said quietly, my voice trembling with controlled rage. "Cancel whatever agreements you've made. Return any money you've collected." Patricia's face flushed red. "We've already spent that money, Howard." "Do you think we'd be here begging if we had other options?" The truth hit me like a physical blow. They hadn't just planned to rent out my cabin. They had already spent money they didn't have based on income they had no legal right to generate. The desperation in Sandra's eyes suddenly made perfect sense. "If you don't cooperate," Patricia continued, "our attorney says we have grounds to challenge Dad's will. He made verbal promises about splitting inheritance equally among his children." I stared at my sisters, these two women I had grown up with, shared holidays with, and trusted with family secrets. The people standing on my porch felt like strangers wearing familiar faces. "Your attorney—" Sandra nodded eagerly. "Robert Kane. He specializes in inheritance disputes and family property law. He says cases like ours succeed in court all the time." As if summoned by our conversation, a black sedan pulled into my driveway. A tall man in an expensive suit climbed out carrying a briefcase and radiating the kind of confidence that comes with years of legal training. He approached our group with the measured stride of someone accustomed to taking charge of difficult situations. "Howard, I presume." He extended his hand with a practiced smile. "Robert Kane, attorney for Patricia and Sandra. I think it's time we had a serious conversation about resolving this matter fairly for everyone involved." Monday morning found me sitting in Janet Walsh's law office, clutching a coffee cup with shaking hands while my attorney reviewed the documents Patricia and Sandra had thrust at me during our confrontation. Janet, a sharp-featured woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair, had been handling my legal affairs since Dad's death 2 years ago. "Howard, this is more complicated than a simple family dispute," she said, adjusting her reading glasses. "The rental management contract appears legally binding, and if they did forge your signature proving, it will require handwriting analysis that could take weeks." My stomach dropped. "Weeks?" "The first renters are supposed to arrive today." Janet nodded grimly. "Sunset Vacation Properties has already processed their booking fees and issued confirmation emails. If you cancel now, you could face breach of contract lawsuits from both the management company and the disappointed customers." I slumped in my chair, feeling trapped in a nightmare that kept expanding beyond my control. "What about the forged signature? That's where things get interesting." Janet pulled out a magnifying glass and studied the contract more closely. "This signature is remarkably accurate. Either your sisters are exceptionally skilled forgers, or they had professional help." The thought of my sisters consulting with criminals to steal my property made me feel sick. Janet continued reviewing documents while I tried to process the magnitude of their betrayal. "There's another problem," she continued. "Robert Kane filed a preliminary injunction claiming fraud in your father's will execution. He's arguing that your father was mentally compromised when he signed the documents leaving you sole ownership of the cabin." "That's ridiculous. Dad was completely lucid when he made his will. You were there during the signing." "I know that, and you know that, but Kane has medical records suggesting your father was taking medication for depression and anxiety during his final months. He's claiming those medications impaired your father's judgment. My hands clenched into fists. Dad had been sad after Mom's death, but he was still sharp as a tack. He had specifically chosen to leave me the cabin because he knew how much it meant to me, how many hours we had spent there together working on projects and talking about life. Janet's phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. After a brief conversation, she hung up with a troubled expression. That was the sheriff's office. Apparently, the first rental family arrived at your cabin this morning with confirmation emails and prepaid receipts. When they found the property locked up and no one available to give them keys, they called the management company. What did Sunset Vacation Properties tell them? That there was a temporary family emergency, but the rental would proceed as scheduled. They're sending a representative to meet the family this afternoon with access keys. I stared at Janet in disbelief. How do they have access keys to my property? That's what we need to find out. It suggests your sisters have been planning this operation for much longer than 3 weeks. I drove back toward the cabin with my mind racing, trying to understand how my life had spiraled so far out of control in just a few days. When I pulled into the driveway, I found a Sunset Vacation Properties van parked near my front door and a confused-looking family standing on my porch with suitcases. The father, a heavy-set man in his 40s wearing a Michigan State t-shirt, approached my car window as I parked. "Excuse me, are you the property manager? We've been waiting here for 2 hours." "I'm the property owner," I replied carefully. "There's been a misunderstanding about this rental." The man's wife joined us holding a printed confirmation email. "We paid $800 for this weekend. Our kids have been looking forward to this vacation for months." Behind them, 2 teenagers stood by the van looking bored and annoyed. The weight of disappointing this innocent family because of my sister's scheme made me feel terrible, but I had no choice. "I'm very sorry, but this property isn't actually available for rental. There was an error in the booking system." The father's face reddened. "An error? We took time off work, drove 4 hours, and spent money we couldn't really afford. You can't just cancel on us at the last minute." Before I could respond, another car pulled up, and a woman in a business suit climbed out carrying a clipboard and a set of keys. She walked directly to the family with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to handling vacation rental logistics. "Sorry for the delay," she announced cheerfully. "I'm Karen from Sunset Vacation Properties. Let's get you folks settled in." I intercepted her before she could reach my front door. "Ma'am, I'm Howard Thompson, the actual owner of this property. There's been a serious misunderstanding." Karen consulted her clipboard with a confused frown. "According to our records, this property is managed under contract by Patricia and Sandra Thompson. They signed all the necessary paperwork 3 weeks ago. Those are my sisters, and they had no authority to sign anything on my behalf." The rental family watched our conversation with growing agitation. The father stepped forward aggressively. "Look, we don't care about your family drama. We have a confirmed reservation and we've paid our money. Either honor your commitment or we're calling our attorney." Karen pulled out her phone and stepped away to make a call, probably to Patricia or Sandra. The family waited impatiently while I tried to figure out how to resolve this situation without causing more problems for myself. After a few minutes, Karen returned with a sympathetic expression. "I've spoken with Patricia Thompson. She says there's a temporary family disagreement, but the rental contracts remain valid. She's asked me to proceed with the check-in process." "Absolutely not," I said firmly. "This is my property and these people cannot stay here." The father's wife started crying, which made their teenage daughter burst into tears as well. The son kicked angrily at the gravel driveway, muttering about ruined vacations and wasted money. "Please," the mother pleaded. "We've been planning this trip for a year. It's our first family vacation since my husband's heart surgery." My resolve wavered as I looked at this struggling family caught in the middle of my sister's fraud. They were innocent victims who deserved better treatment, but I couldn't allow strangers to occupy my father's cabin based on forged documents. Karen tried again. "Mr. Thompson, perhaps we could work out a compromise. The family could stay just for tonight while you sort out the legal issues with your sisters." "No, I want everyone off my property immediately." The father exploded. This is unbelievable. We're definitely suing somebody over this disaster. As they loaded their suitcases back into their car, the mother handed me a business card. Our attorney will be in touch about compensation for our expenses and emotional distress. After they drove away, Karen remained behind studying her paperwork with obvious confusion. Mr. Thompson, I have to tell you that canceling confirmed reservations creates serious liability issues for our company. We have 3 more families scheduled to arrive over the next 2 weeks. Then you need to cancel those reservations immediately. We can't do that without written authorization from the contract signers, which according to our records are Patricia and Sandra Thompson. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of legal maze designed to prevent me from controlling my own property. Karen handed me her business card and suggested I resolve the matter quickly to avoid further complications. After she left, I walked around my cabin checking for signs of unauthorized entry. Everything appeared normal from the outside, but when I tried my key in the front door lock, it didn't work. They had changed my locks. I walked around to the back of the cabin and tried the kitchen door with the same result. The window locks had been replaced as well. My sisters hadn't just planned to rent out my property. They had effectively locked me out of my own inheritance. Standing in my father's driveway, unable to enter the cabin where I had spent the best years of my childhood, I felt a level of betrayal that cut deeper than anything I had ever experienced. Patricia and Sandra hadn't just stolen my property. They had stolen my connection to Dad's memory and turned my sanctuary into a business commodity. I pulled out my phone and called Janet Walsh. They changed the locks, I told her. I can't get into my own cabin. That's trespassing and vandalism, Janet replied immediately. We're filing criminal charges first thing tomorrow morning. As I drove away from the cabin I could no longer enter, I noticed a small detail that made my blood run cold. There were tire tracks in the grass leading around to the back of the property and fresh scratches on the basement door frame. Someone had been coming and going from my cabin regularly and they hadn't been using the front entrance. Tuesday morning I returned to the cabin with a locksmith and Janet Walsh in tow, determined to regain access to my own property. What we discovered inside made my betrayal by Patricia and Sandra seem almost quaint compared to the magnitude of their actual theft. The cabin I entered bore no resemblance to the home my father had lovingly maintained for 30 years. Gone were his comfortable, well-worn furniture pieces, replaced by generic rental property fixtures that looked like they came from a discount hotel supplier. The walls had been painted over Dad's carefully chosen earth tones with bland beige that eliminated every trace of personality from the space. They've completely redecorated, I whispered, running my hand along a plastic dining table where Dad's handmade oak masterpiece used to sit. Janet pulled out her phone and began documenting everything with photographs. The locksmith, a weathered man named Pete, who had known my father, shook his head in disgust. Howard, your dad, would roll over in his grave seeing this place. They threw away his custom woodwork and replaced it with particle board garbage. I walked into Dad's workshop, the sacred space where he had taught me to use tools, and shared stories about his own father. The walls where he had written measurements and project notes in his careful handwriting were now covered with fresh white paint. His vintage workbench, built from solid maple and worn smooth by decades of use, was gone. Where's his workbench? I asked aloud, though I dreaded the answer. Pete pointed toward the corner where a flimsy metal table now held plastic organizers filled with generic tools. They hauled the real furniture out of here 3 weeks ago. I saw them loading a big truck one morning when I was driving past. The violation felt physical, like someone had surgically removed parts of my heart. Every meaningful object that connected this place to my father's memory had been systematically eliminated and replaced with soulless, commercial alternatives designed to maximize rental appeal. Janet found paperwork scattered across the kitchen counter that revealed the scope of my sister's operation. Receipts from furniture stores, paint suppliers, and cleaning services totaled over $8,000. But the most shocking discovery was a stack of credit card statements in my name Howard, they've been using your credit cards, Janet said grimly. The receipts match charges on your accounts going back 6 weeks. I studied the statements recognizing purchases I had never made. They had accessed my financial information and funded their entire renovation project with my money, while I remained completely unaware of their activities. How did they get my credit card information? Janet held up several opened envelopes with my name and address. They've been intercepting your mail. These statements should have alerted you to unauthorized charges weeks ago. The realization hit me like a physical blow. While I had been living my normal life, working my consulting job and visiting the cabin on weekends, my sisters had been conducting elaborate financial fraud using my stolen identity. They hadn't just betrayed my trust. They had committed serious crimes that could have destroyed my credit rating and financial stability. Pete finished installing new locks and handed me a set of keys. These should keep everyone out except you, Howard. But you might want to consider a security system given what's been happening here. As Janet and Pete prepared to leave, I heard voices approaching from the lake path. Through the window, I saw Patricia and Sandra walking toward the cabin, accompanied by their husbands Derek and Marcus. Patricia spotted my car, and her expression shifted from surprise to anger. She marched up to the front door and tried her key, which no longer worked thanks to Pete's lock replacement. "Howard, open this door immediately," she shouted. "We have renters arriving tomorrow and we need to prepare the cabin." I stepped onto the porch flanked by Janet, who had her phone ready to record any confrontation. Patricia looked different somehow, more desperate and disheveled than her usually polished appearance. "There are no more renters," I announced firmly. "This illegal operation ends today." Derek, Patricia's husband, stepped forward with an aggressive posture I recognized from his college football days. At 6 feet 3 inches with arms covered in construction worker tattoos, he had always intimidated people through physical presence rather than intelligent conversation. "You're being selfish, Howard," he growled. "Your sisters are trying to save their families while you hoard this property like some kind of hermit." Sandra started crying again, but her tears seemed calculated rather than genuine. "Howard, please don't destroy our lives over pride. We can make this work for everyone." Marcus, Sandra's husband, remained silent, but kept glancing toward the workshop with an expression that made me uncomfortable. Something about his body language suggested guilt or nervousness that went beyond simple family conflict. "We've invested too much money to stop now," Patricia declared. "If you don't cooperate, we'll force a sale of this property to recover our losses." Janet stepped forward with her attorney voice. "Your investments were made illegally using stolen funds and forged documents. Any losses you've incurred are consequences of your own criminal behavior." Derek's face flushed red at the word criminal. "Criminal? We're trying to help family members in crisis. Howard's the one being criminal by hoarding inherited property while his sisters lose their homes." "Show them the credit card statements," Janet suggested quietly. I handed Patricia the stack of financial documents that proved they had stolen thousands of dollars from my accounts. Her face went pale as she recognized the evidence of their fraud. Sandra looked at her husband with panic in her eyes. "Marcus, you said those charges would never be traced back to us." Marcus grabbed Sandra's arm, roughly, clearly angry that she had revealed his involvement in planning their financial crimes. The dynamic between them suggested an abusive relationship where Marcus controlled Sandra through intimidation and manipulation. "Everyone needs to leave this property immediately," Janet announced. "Further trespassing will result in additional criminal charges." As they started walking back toward their car, Derek turned around with a threatening expression. "This isn't over, Howard. Family loyalty means something even if you've forgotten that." After they drove away, Janet and I spent another hour documenting the damage and theft. The total value of stolen and destroyed property exceeded $20,000, not including the emotional value of irreplaceable family heirlooms. "We'll file comprehensive charges tomorrow morning," Janet assured me. Grand theft, identity fraud, burglary, and criminal trespass should be enough to get their attention. That evening, I sat alone in the cabin trying to process the magnitude of my sister's betrayal. They hadn't just stolen my property, they had methodically destroyed every meaningful connection between this place and our father's memory, then tried to make me feel guilty for protecting what rightfully belonged to me. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside that sounded like footsteps on gravel. I looked out the window, but saw nothing in the darkness. Security lights would be my next investment, assuming I could prevent further break-ins long enough to install them. I was beginning to understand that Patricia and Sandra's desperation ran deeper than simple financial problems. Their willingness to commit multiple felonies suggested they were either working with people who had convinced them these crimes were somehow justified, or they were being pressured by threats I didn't fully understand yet. Either way, the innocent sisters I had grown up with were gone, replaced by strangers who viewed me as an obstacle to be eliminated rather than family worth preserving. Wednesday morning brought news that confirmed my worst fears. I returned to the cabin to find the basement door standing open and obvious signs that someone had been inside during the night. They weren't just planning to steal my property through legal manipulation. They were escalating to outright burglary. I installed a complete security camera system Thursday afternoon, determined to catch whoever was violating my property during nighttime hours. The cameras covered every entrance and the interior spaces where my father's most valuable belongings were stored. What the footage revealed over the next week surpassed even my darkest suspicions about how far my sisters and their husbands were willing to go. Friday night's recording showed Derek and Marcus arriving at the cabin around 2 o'clock in the morning, using bolt cutters to remove the new locks I had installed on the basement entrance. They moved with practiced efficiency, suggesting this wasn't their first unauthorized entry into my property. I watched in stunned silence as they systematically loaded my father's antique fishing equipment into a pickup truck. Rods and reels that Dad had collected over 40 years, some dating back to his own father's generation, disappeared into the darkness, like they were common garage sale items rather than irreplaceable family treasures. The worst part was listening to their conversation through the camera's audio system. Derek treated the theft like a routine business transaction, commenting on the potential resale value of various items while Marcus worried about getting caught. "Howard's got insurance," Derek said dismissively. "He can file a claim and buy new stuff. We need this money more than he needs old fishing gear." Marcus seemed nervous but continued loading boxes. Patricia said he's got some expensive tools in the workshop. Those old hand planes and chisels could be worth serious money to collectors. They spent nearly 3 hours methodically stripping valuable items from the cabin, paying particular attention to anything that looked antique or handmade. Dad's vintage wooden boat, a beautiful 14-foot guide boat he had restored himself, proved too heavy for them to move alone. "We'll come back tomorrow night with help," Derek announced. "That boat's got to be worth $10,000 to the right buyer." Saturday's footage showed them returning with a third man. I didn't recognize someone younger and stronger who helped them wrestle Dad's boat onto a trailer. Watching strangers manhandle my father's pride and joy, scraping the carefully maintained finish against their cheap trailer made me feel physically sick. But Sunday night's recording revealed something far worse than simple theft. Derek and Marcus returned alone this time, carrying a large container and what appeared to be testing equipment. I watched in horror as they accessed the cabin's well system and began adding something to the water supply. Marcus operated some kind of digital meter, while Derek poured liquid from unmarked bottles into the well housing. "How much longer before this stuff takes effect?" Marcus asked. Derek consulted a smartphone app. The guy said anywhere from 3 to 7 days depending on body weight and frequency of consumption. "Howard drinks coffee here every weekend, so it should work pretty fast." "What if he gets seriously sick?" "That's the point," Derek replied coldly. "We need him disoriented and confused when our lawyer files the mental incompetence paperwork. A few weeks of erratic behavior, and Patricia gets legal authority to make decisions about family property." The magnitude of their plan crashed over me like a tidal wave. They weren't just stealing my belongings. They were systematically poisoning me to support false claims about my mental stability. Every weekend headache and fatigue I had attributed to work stress was actually evidence of their deliberate attempt to chemically compromise my health. Monday morning, I drove straight to the hospital emergency room with recordings from my security cameras and samples of water from my cabin's well system. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the attending physician, took my concerns seriously enough to order comprehensive blood tests and toxicology screening. "Mr. Thompson, we found traces of benzodiazepine compounds in your blood," she explained after reviewing the lab results. "These are prescription sedatives that can cause confusion, memory problems, and erratic behavior when administered without medical supervision." "How long have I been ingesting these drugs?" "Based on the concentration levels, probably 3 to 4 weeks, long enough to affect your cognitive function and emotional stability." The timeline matched perfectly with my sister's rental scheme and their increasingly aggressive legal tactics. They had been drugging me while simultaneously building a case that I was mentally unfit to manage my own affairs. Dr. Chen provided detailed medical documentation of the poisoning, which I immediately delivered to Janet Walsh along with the security camera footage. Her reaction was immediate and decisive. "This is attempted murder, Howard. We're taking everything to the district attorney's office this afternoon." Tuesday morning brought a confrontation I had been dreading, but knew was inevitable. I arrived at the cabin to find Patricia and Sandra waiting in their car, apparently expecting another opportunity to continue their manipulation campaign. They approached me with expressions of fake concern that would have been laughable if the situation weren't so serious. "Howard, you look terrible," Patricia said with feigned sympathy. "We're worried about your mental health. Maybe you should consider checking into a facility for professional evaluation." Sandra nodded earnestly. "We've been talking to specialists about inherited depression and anxiety disorders. There are excellent treatment programs that could help you work through Dad's death and these unrealistic attachments to material possessions." The audacity of their performance was breathtaking. After systematically poisoning me for weeks, they were now trying to use my resulting symptoms as evidence that I needed psychological intervention under their supervision. "I know what you've been doing to my well water," I said quietly. Patricia's expression didn't change, but Sandra's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about. Derek and Marcus have been adding sedatives to my water supply. I have video footage of them contaminating the well system." Patricia laughed dismissively. "That's exactly the kind of paranoid thinking we're concerned about, Howard. You're seeing conspiracies where none exist." Sandra started crying again, but this time the tears looked genuine. "Howard, we never meant for things to go this far. We were just trying to help our families survive. By poisoning me, we didn't know they were doing that," Sandra whispered. "Derek said they were just going to borrow some things temporarily until we could work out a fair arrangement." Patricia grabbed Sandra's arm sharply, clearly angry that her sister was breaking ranks and admitting to knowledge of the criminal activities. "Sandra, we agreed not to discuss family business with someone who's obviously having mental health issues." I pulled out my phone and played a section of audio from Sunday night's recording, where Derek clearly stated their plan to make me appear mentally incompetent. Patricia listened to her husband's voice describing their poisoning scheme with an expression of genuine shock. Either she was an exceptional actress, or Derek had been conducting this operation without her full knowledge. "Derek wouldn't do something like that," she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Your husband has been systematically drugging me for weeks while you filed legal papers claiming I'm mentally unfit. The timing isn't a coincidence." Sandra collapsed onto the porch steps, sobbing uncontrollably. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt. I just needed money to save my house." Patricia remained standing, but her confident facade was crumbling as she processed the implications of what Derek had done without consulting her. "If this is true, then Derek has destroyed everything," she said quietly. "The legal case, the rental business, our family relationships. He's turned us into criminals." 2 police cars pulled into my driveway, followed by Janet Walsh in her sedan. The officers approached us with professional courtesy but obvious authority. "Patricia Thompson and Sandra Miller," the senior officer inquired. Both women nodded, Patricia with resigned dignity and Sandra with obvious terror. "You're under arrest for conspiracy fraud and identity theft. You have the right to remain silent." As they were handcuffed and led to the police cars, Sandra looked back at me with desperate pleading in her eyes. "Howard, please don't let them destroy our families over this. Our children don't deserve to suffer because their parents made terrible decisions." I watched my sisters being driven away in police custody, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness that I hadn't anticipated. Justice was finally being served, but the cost was the complete destruction of family relationships that had once meant everything to me. Janet approached with documents requiring my signature for the formal charges. "Derek and Marcus will be arrested this afternoon. We have enough evidence to ensure serious prison time for everyone involved." Standing in my father's driveway, finally safe from the people who had systematically betrayed and poisoned me, I realized that winning this battle would require learning to live with the knowledge that family loyalty was a privilege that could be permanently forfeited through cruelty and criminal behavior. The cabin was mine again, but the innocence and trust that had made it a true sanctuary were gone forever. The next phase of building a comprehensive case against Patricia, Sandra, Derek, and Marcus required methodical documentation of their crimes and cooperation with law enforcement agencies I never imagined I would need to contact. Detective Rachel Martinez, assigned to coordinate the investigation, proved to be exactly the kind of thorough professional this complex case demanded. "Mr. Thompson, what we have here is far more sophisticated than typical family theft," she explained during our first formal interview. "The level of planning and coordination suggests your sister's husbands have experience with financial fraud and identity crimes." Over the following week, Detective Martinez and her team uncovered layers of criminal activity that extended far beyond my immediate situation. Derek's background check revealed 2 previous arrests for check fraud and a civil judgment related to construction contract violations. Marcus had been fired from his last 3 jobs for theft and had pending charges for disability insurance fraud. "Your sisters chose their husbands poorly," Detective Martinez observed with dry humor. "These men appear to have used family relationships as cover for ongoing criminal enterprises." The security camera footage proved invaluable for establishing timeline and intent. Derek and Marcus had been entering my cabin illegally for over 6 weeks, far longer than the 3-week period Patricia and Sandra had originally claimed for their rental operation. "Look at this," Detective Martinez said, pointing to timestamps on various recordings. "They were stealing your belongings and selling them online weeks before your sisters ever mentioned financial difficulties or rental plans." She showed me printouts from eBay and Facebook Marketplace, where my father's tools and collectibles were being offered for sale by accounts registered to Derek and Marcus. The descriptions included details that proved they had intimate knowledge of the item's provenance and value. "They researched the market value of your father's possessions before they started stealing," Detective Martinez continued. "This wasn't desperation theft. This was calculated burglary designed to maximize profit while minimizing detection." The water contamination analysis revealed the most disturbing aspect of their criminal conspiracy. Dr. Chen's toxicology report, combined with chemical analysis of the well water, showed that Derek and Marcus had been introducing increasingly concentrated sedative compounds over several weeks. The dosage progression suggests they were experimenting to find levels that would impair your judgment without causing obvious physical symptoms, Detective Martinez explained. Someone with pharmaceutical knowledge helped them design this poisoning regimen. Further investigation revealed that Derek's younger brother, Robert Kane, the attorney representing Patricia and Sandra, was actually a disbarred lawyer who had been operating illegally for the past 3 years. His law license had been revoked following conviction for embezzlement and ethical violations related to client fraud. Robert Kane lost his license for stealing from estate settlements, Detective Martinez informed me. He's been running fake legal services using forged credentials and targeting families dealing with inheritance disputes. The scope of Robert Kane's illegal practice included dozens of victims across 3 states. My case provided the evidence needed to expose his entire operation and help other families recover from similar fraud schemes. Your sisters didn't just hire a bad lawyer, Detective Martinez continued. They hired a criminal who specializes in inheritance theft and has been using their case to test new fraud techniques. Janet Walsh worked closely with the prosecution team to ensure comprehensive charges that reflected the full extent of the criminal conspiracy. The final indictment included grand theft identity fraud, elder abuse conspiracy to commit fraud practicing law without a license, and attempted poisoning. The poisoning charges are the most serious, Janet explained. Derek and Marcus are facing felony assault charges that could result in 15 to 20 years in prison. Patricia and Sandra, as willing participants in the financial fraud, faced 5 to 10 years on conspiracy charges, even though they claimed ignorance about the poisoning scheme. The most satisfying development came when Detective Martinez's team discovered that Derek had been recording his conversations with Marcus and Robert Kane as insurance against potential double-crossing by his co-conspirators. Derek apparently didn't trust his partners, Detective Martinez said with amusement. His phone contained hours of recordings where they discuss poisoning you, forging documents, and selling your belongings. He essentially created a complete confession to all their crimes. The recordings revealed that Robert Kane had been coaching Derek and Marcus on techniques for creating believable mental incompetence cases, including specific drugs that would cause confusion without triggering obvious medical concerns. We need Howard disoriented but not obviously sick, Robert Kane's voice explained on one recording. Gradual cognitive decline that supports our legal arguments about inherited depression and poor judgment. Marcus expressed concerns about potential criminal liability, but Derek dismissed his worries with casual brutality. Howard's a loner with no close friends, Derek said. Even if he figures out what's happening, who's going to believe him over his own sisters? We control the narrative because we control the family relationships. The recordings also documented their plan to escalate to physical violence if the legal and chemical approaches proved insufficient to force my cooperation. If the drugs don't work fast enough, we might need to create an accident, Derek suggested. Something that puts Howard in the hospital long enough for Patricia to get emergency guardianship powers. Listening to my brother-in-law discuss plans to physically injure me with the same casual tone he might use to describe weekend fishing plans was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire ordeal. Detective Martinez assured me that the evidence package was overwhelming enough to guarantee convictions for everyone involved. Your security cameras captured everything we need to prove premeditation and conspiracy, she said confidently. Combined with the medical evidence of poisoning and the financial records showing systematic theft, this case is prosecutors' dream. The investigation also uncovered the mechanism Derek and Marcus had used to access my financial information. Sandra had been collecting my mail for months, intercepting bank statements and credit card bills that allowed them to monitor my accounts and identify opportunities for fraud. They knew your spending patterns well enough to make fraudulent purchases that wouldn't immediately trigger fraud alerts, Detective Martinez explained. The renovation expenses were spread across multiple cards and designed to mimic your normal spending behavior. As the evidence mounted, Patricia and Sandra's attorney began discussing plea bargain arrangements that would require full cooperation with the prosecution and restitution for all stolen property and financial damages. They're looking at significant prison time unless they provide complete testimony against Derek Marcus and Robert Kane, Janet Walsh informed me. The prosecutor is willing to consider reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation that helps convict the main organizers. I found myself in the unexpected position of having some influence over my sister's ultimate punishment. Their futures depended partly on my willingness to support plea agreements that might result in lighter sentences. Standing in my father's restored cabin, surrounded by evidence of their systematic betrayal, I had to decide whether justice required maximum punishment or whether family mercy still had a place in this devastated relationship. The choice would define not only their consequences, but also the kind of person I wanted to be after surviving the worst betrayal of my life. The moment I had been anticipating for weeks finally arrived on a gray Tuesday morning in November when Detective Martinez called with news that would reshape the entire legal landscape of my case. "Howard, we executed arrest warrants this morning," she announced with obvious satisfaction. "Derek Marcus and Robert Kane are all in custody facing federal charges in addition to the state crimes we've been building. The federal involvement resulted from Robert Kane's illegal law practice crossing state lines and Derek's use of internet sales platforms to dispose of stolen property. What had begun as a family dispute had evolved into a multi-jurisdictional criminal case with implications far beyond my personal situation. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit has been tracking Robert Kane for 2 years," Detective Martinez explained. "Your case provided the evidence they needed to bring down his entire organization. Janet Walsh had worked tirelessly with federal prosecutors to ensure that my stolen property would be recovered and that restitution would be comprehensive enough to cover not only financial losses, but also emotional damages and medical expenses related to the poisoning. We've frozen all of Derek and Marcus's assets, including proceeds from selling your father's belongings," Janet informed me during our strategy meeting. "Everything they stole will be returned or compensated at current market value." The prosecution's case was strengthened immeasurably by Derek's recorded conversations, which provided documented evidence of premeditation and conspiracy that eliminated any possibility of claiming the crimes were impulsive or unplanned. "Derek essentially prosecuted himself," Janet observed with professional admiration. "His paranoia about being betrayed by his co-conspirators led him to create a complete audio confession to every crime they committed. Patricia and Sandra's cooperation with the investigation proved crucial for understanding the full scope of the criminal enterprise and identifying additional victims of Robert Kane's fraudulent legal practice. Your sisters are providing testimony that's helping other families recover from similar inheritance fraud schemes," Detective Martinez explained. "They may have made terrible choices, but they're helping ensure justice for people who suffered similar crimes." The emotional complexity of watching my sisters testify against their own husbands was unexpected. Patricia appeared genuinely shocked by the extent of Derek's criminal planning, while Sandra seemed relieved to finally escape from what investigators had determined was an abusive relationship with Marcus. Sandra's medical records show evidence of domestic violence going back several years, Detective Martinez informed me privately. Marcus had been controlling her through intimidation and threats that escalated to involving her in criminal activities. Understanding that Sandra's participation might have resulted from coercion rather than greed softened my anger toward her, though it didn't excuse the damage her choices had caused to our family relationships. Patricia's situation was more complicated. Her cooperation with the prosecution was motivated primarily by self-preservation rather than genuine remorse, and she continued to justify her actions as necessary responses to financial desperation. "Patricia still believes she was entitled to profit from your inheritance," Janet observed. "She's cooperating because it's legally advantageous, not because she accepts responsibility for the harm she caused." The federal investigation uncovered a network of inheritance fraud cases spanning multiple states, with Robert Kane's fake law practice at the center of a systematic scheme targeting families dealing with estate disputes. Over 50 families were victimized by this organization, Detective Martinez reported. "Your decision to install security cameras and fight back helped expose crimes that might have continued indefinitely. The personal satisfaction of seeing justice served was complicated by the ongoing legal proceedings and media attention that accompanied such a high-profile federal case. Local newspapers and television stations covered the story extensively, turning my private family nightmare into public entertainment. Federal inheritance fraud case exposes multi-state criminal network, read the headline in our regional newspaper, accompanied by photos of Derek Marcus and Robert Kane being led away in handcuffs. The media coverage brought unexpected support from other families who had experienced similar betrayals by relatives seeking to profit from inherited property. I received dozens of letters and emails from people sharing their own stories of family theft and legal manipulation. Your courage in fighting back inspired other victims to come forward, Detective Martinez told me. The publicity generated by your case is helping law enforcement identify patterns of inheritance fraud that were previously invisible. The criminal trials proceeded efficiently due to overwhelming evidence and the defendant's recorded confessions. Derek received a 23-year federal sentence for conspiracy fraud and attempted poisoning. Marcus was sentenced to 18 years on similar charges. Robert Kane faced 45 years for operating a fraudulent legal practice and multiple counts of elder abuse. Patricia and Sandra, in exchange for their cooperation and guilty pleas to reduced charges, received sentences of 3 years probation and restitution orders requiring them to pay triple damages for their participation in the financial fraud. The court recognizes that Patricia and Sandra were influenced by manipulative partners. Judge Catherine Rivers explained during sentencing. However, their willingness to participate in fraud against a family member requires meaningful consequences and comprehensive restitution. The restitution orders provided complete compensation for stolen property renovation damages, medical expenses, legal fees, and punitive damages that reflected the emotional trauma caused by their systematic betrayal. You'll receive approximately $200,000 in total restitution, Janet calculated, enough to restore the cabin completely and establish a trust fund that ensures this property can never be threatened by family financial problems again. The most meaningful aspect of the legal resolution was the court's acknowledgement that inheritance rights represent more than simple property ownership. Judge Rivers' sentencing statement specifically addressed the emotional and cultural significance of family property. Family inheritance represents the continuation of values, memories, and relationships that transcend monetary value, she declared. Crimes against inherited property violate not only legal rights, but also the sacred trust between generations. Recovery of my father's stolen belongings proved partially successful. Many items had been sold and could not be recovered, but insurance settlements and restitution payments provided funds to acquire period-appropriate replacements that honored his memory while creating new traditions. Your father's workshop tools were mostly recovered intact, Detective Martinez reported with satisfaction. Derek apparently kept the most valuable items in storage rather than selling them immediately. Rebuilding the cabin to reflect Dad's original design while incorporating modern security features became a therapeutic project that helped me process the trauma while creating something positive from the destruction my sisters had caused. The restoration work attracted attention from local craftsmen who had known my father and wanted to contribute to preserving his legacy. What began as personal healing evolved into a community project that strengthened connections with people who valued family traditions and honest relationships. Your father would be proud of how you fought to protect his legacy, commented Tom Bradley, a local woodworker who had learned techniques from Dad decades earlier. Standing up to family bullies takes more courage than fighting strangers. As the legal proceedings concluded and the restoration neared completion, I found myself facing a decision about whether to maintain any relationship with Patricia and Sandra after their probation periods ended. Their crimes had been punished, their debts to society and to me would be paid, but the fundamental trust that defines family relationships had been permanently destroyed by their willingness to poison and rob their own brother for financial gain. The final chapter of this devastating family betrayal began 18 months later when Patricia and Sandra completed their probation periods and attempted to re-establish contact with me. Their letters delivered through Janet Walsh to avoid direct communication that might violate legal agreements revealed the long-term consequences of their choices and the different paths their lives had taken since the criminal convictions. Patricia's letter was brief and businesslike, focusing primarily on financial concerns and legal technicalities rather than addressing the emotional damage her actions had caused. She had divorced Derek while he was in prison and was working as a customer service representative for a telecommunications company, struggling to support herself on a fraction of her previous real estate income. "I understand you may not want personal contact," she wrote, "but I hope we can eventually discuss practical matters like family gatherings and maintaining relationships with each other's children." Sandra's letter was longer and more emotionally complex, revealing that she had spent months in counseling working through the abusive relationship dynamics that had contributed to her participation in the criminal conspiracy. "I know I can never undo the harm I caused," she wrote, "but I want you to understand that I was terrified of Marcus and felt trapped in a situation I didn't know how to escape. That doesn't excuse my choices, but it explains why I made decisions that violated everything I believed about family loyalty and personal integrity." Sandra had successfully completed a vocational training program and was working as a medical billing specialist while raising her 2 children as a single mother. Marcus was serving his 18-year sentence in federal prison, and Sandra had filed for divorce and obtained a permanent restraining order that would prevent future contact. Reading their letters in the restored cabin surrounded by Dad's carefully rebuilt workshop and the peaceful atmosphere he had loved, I felt a complex mixture of emotions that had evolved significantly since the height of the legal battles. The rage and betrayal that had consumed me during the criminal proceedings had gradually transformed into something more like sadness for the family relationships that could never be repaired, and acceptance that some violations of trust are simply too profound to forgive. I had invested the restitution money in establishing the Thompson Family Heritage Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping other families preserve inherited property and resist inheritance fraud. The foundation provided legal assistance, security consulting, and emotional support for people facing similar betrayals by relatives seeking to profit from family deaths. "We've helped over 200 families in the past year," reported Sarah Mitchell, the foundation's executive director and a former victim of inheritance fraud herself. "Your willingness to share your story and provide resources has created a nationwide support network for people dealing with family property crimes." The foundation's work brought unexpected personal fulfillment that helped transform my traumatic experience into meaningful advocacy for other vulnerable families. Speaking at conferences about inheritance protection and family financial boundaries allowed me to help people avoid the devastation I'd experienced. "The most important lesson from your case," I often told audiences, "is that family relationships don't automatically deserve trust, and protecting your boundaries isn't selfish when dealing with people who view your inheritance as their opportunity." The cabin itself had become both a restored sanctuary and a symbolic victory over the people who had tried to destroy my connection to Dad's memory. The workshop now hosted weekend classes where I taught traditional woodworking techniques to young people from the community, continuing Dad's legacy of sharing knowledge and craftsmanship. "Your father's workshop is alive again," commented Tom Bradley during one of our weekend sessions. "Teaching kids these skills honors his memory better than any monument could." The security system that had initially been installed to catch criminals now served the more pleasant purpose of monitoring wildlife around the lake and creating time-lapse videos of seasonal changes that Dad would have loved to see. One year after the criminal trials concluded, Detective Martinez visited the cabin to see the restoration results and update me on the broader impact of the case. The Robert Kane Network prosecution resulted in convictions for 37 defendants across 12 states, she reported with obvious pride. Your courage in fighting back helped bring justice for hundreds of victims and dismantled one of the largest inheritance fraud organizations in the country. The ripple effects of standing up to family criminals had extended far beyond my personal situation, creating legal precedents and investigative techniques that continue to protect other families from similar predatory schemes. As autumn arrived, and I prepared for another winter of peaceful solitude in Dad's cabin, I reflected on the profound life lessons that emerged from surviving the worst betrayal imaginable. Trust, I had learned, is a privilege that must be earned through consistent behavior over time, not an automatic right granted by genetic relationships or childhood memories. Family loyalty becomes meaningless when it requires tolerating criminal behavior or accepting systematic abuse disguised as love. The most difficult but necessary lesson was understanding that some relationships are too toxic to preserve, regardless of shared history or blood connections. Protecting yourself from people who view your well-being as an obstacle to their goals isn't cruel or selfish. It's essential for maintaining the personal integrity that makes life worth living. Standing on Dad's porch as winter approached, watching the lake reflect the colors of sunset he had loved so much, I felt the deep peace that comes from knowing I had fought the right battle and won it completely. The cabin was finally safe, Dad's memory was honored and preserved, and my future was free from the people who had tried to steal both my inheritance and my identity for their temporary financial benefit. Justice had been served not just through prison sentences and restitution payments, but through the knowledge that standing up to family bullies had protected countless other families from experiencing similar violations of trust and love. I had learned that real family consists of people who support your growth and respect your boundaries, not those who exploit genetic connections to justify criminal behavior. The Foundation's work connected me with dozens of people who had become chosen family through shared experiences and mutual respect. As I settled into my father's favorite chair beside the fireplace he had built with his own hands, I felt grateful for the hard-won wisdom that emerged from surviving betrayal and the peaceful sanctuary that existed because I had refused to surrender what mattered most. The people who had tried to destroy my life were facing the consequences of their choices in federal prison, while I was living freely in the place that represented everything valuable about family traditions, personal integrity, and the courage to fight for what you believe in. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to let toxic people define your future and building something beautiful from the wreckage of their attempts to destroy your life. Have you ever had to make the difficult decision to cut ties with family members who repeatedly violated your trust and boundaries? What advice would you give to someone dealing with relatives who feel entitled to their inheritance or possessions? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family drama and betrayal, and share it with anyone who might be facing similar challenges with toxic family relationships. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that protecting yourself from people who hurt you isn't selfish. It's necessary for building the peaceful, authentic life you deserve.